Euthanasia is to intentionally die or be killed in order to avoid unnecessary suffering. The ethical debate around it is nothing new. Every culture has had their own specific relationship with death. Some have embraced voluntary death and others have not. However, beyond moving ethical arguments for life or against suffering, there is another factor that determines our use of euthanasia, and that is simple: numbers. Once the numbers favor either of the two positions, it is very easy to find moral justifications for mathematical calculations. The simple fact is that today, from a pragmatic point of view, euthanasia is becoming increasingly attractive. So much so that I predict that during the 21st century, we will kill like never before. Hundreds of millions will die in the spirit of arithmetic and in the name of compassion. Before we start, we need to make two important distinctions. First, euthanasia can be passive, where one lets a terminal disease kill the patient while ameliorating the suffering, or it can be active, where one directly ends the life of the patient. The second important distinction is that of voluntary and involuntary euthanasia. Involuntary euthanasia is not actively practiced in any country today, but many countries and states have legalized voluntary euthanasia, aka assisted suicide, such as Belgium, Switzerland, Canada, and some US states such as Oregon. Although the euthanasia debate has been going on since the dawn of modern medicine in the 17th and 18th centuries, the actual legalization of voluntary euthanasia is exclusively a 21st century phenomenon. The first country to do so was the Netherlands in 2002. Since then, it has been legalized in several other countries, and the debate has resurfaced. Here is the current prevalence by country. The simple fact is that at all times there are limited medical resources in any given society, and that these resources have to be allocated in one way or another. In the cases where there is not enough for everyone, attention will be given to some and not to others, according to their age, social status, and medical condition. It is precisely in these contexts where the question of euthanasia becomes relevant. It is a fact that the people who require the largest amount of medical attention are the elderly, and this means that healthcare is an industry that circles around the needs of the old. Of course, this does not mean that young people do not need medical attention, but that the medical resources that the average 80-year-old receives are many times what the average 20-year-old needs. The best case scenario for healthcare would be a country which is economically well off and has a young population. There are many young people who require little medical attention and are able to provide it, and few old people who require much of it and cannot provide it themselves. In this case, there are enough medical resources for everyone's needs, and thus there is no need to make the difficult choice of who gets treated and who gets left out in the cold. But now let's imagine the worst possible scenario. A country in severe economic hardship with a population where the old outnumber the young. In such a case, the medical resources will be strained to begin with because of the economic situation, and this would be further compounded by having millions of old people who demand constant medical attention. This increased demand for healthcare would fall on the shoulders of the younger generations, who will have to staff the hospitals and pay, directly or indirectly, for the increased expenses of the old. But the young could not easily take over the jobs of the previous generation due to their age cohort being significantly smaller than that of the retirees. The result would be evident: desperate demand and insufficient resources, which would lead to crippling prices and many not being able to access treatment. The question of euthanasia in the best case scenario is plainly ridiculous. Why would one let grandma die when there are the available resources to try everything to save her? In such cases, it is easy to listen to the anti-euthanasia arguments that attempt to save lives at all costs. After all, who does not want to have the healthcare system at their disposal when they are facing a deadly disease? On the other hand, the usefulness of euthanasia becomes evident when there is an acute shortage of healthcare resources. By the nature of the practice itself, all medical professionals are in constant contact with death, and in fact, medical treatment to the elderly is not about saving their lives, but instead it's about postponing their deaths. If death is already a given and we cannot treat everybody, then the logical thing, even the humane thing to do, is to ease the suffering of the dying through a short and painless death, as opposed to a prolonged agony. Thus, it is no surprise that Canada, arguably the country with the most strained healthcare system with an average of 30 weeks to see a specialist, is also the country most known for its euthanasia program. So far, medical assistance in dying, commonly known as MAID, has ended the lives of 60,000 Canadians. A country like Canada is nowhere close to the worst case scenario where the healthcare system collapses. Canada's economy is still strong despite its recent stagnation, and the average age is 40.3 years, which is not bad, especially when compared with Japan's 49.8 years. However, the point here is not to give an exhaustive report of the state of healthcare around the world, but to point out that euthanasia has a clear internal logic. Today, euthanasia is a niche topic because the healthcare systems of most countries are still in good shape, and therefore euthanasia is not a practical necessity. What is indisputable is that this is changing. Virtually all countries are in a process of aging, of having more old people than young people, and due to having 50 years of declining birth rates, this means that every single country will be very, very slowly moving away from the best case scenario and sliding closer and closer to the worst case scenario. A gradual process, but there is no way to escape the numbers. The simple reality is that a country with more elderly people will have a higher medical demand, and a country with fewer younger people will have a limited number of medical resources. Perhaps this problem will be solved by technological developments, but it does not seem to me that we are living in an age of revolutionary medical breakthroughs such as penicillin, but instead of gradual and expensive improvements to already existing technologies. As the demographic structure of most countries continues to shift, the strain on their respective medical resources will also increase, and I believe that this will lead to the expansion of euthanasia programs around the world. Indeed, the recent legislation in Western Europe, the US, and Australia is no coincidence. But so far, I have been negligent. I have talked about the whole world as if their healthcare systems were run on the same model. Clearly, the social consequences of a strained public healthcare system are very different to those of a private one. Both show their deficiencies in very different ways. A universal healthcare system, a public healthcare system, under strain will show its problems in an increasing number of inefficiencies and shortages. Since a public system has a limited budget and cannot expand rapidly, it will not be able to keep up with the demand, and this will lead to increased wait times and lower service quality. The Canadian system and the British NHS are common examples of rising inefficiency. I believe that in these systems, age will be the defining factor. As we have already mentioned, the retirees require medical resources, and the workforce has to provide them. The result is that there is a disconnect between the people who need healthcare and the people who pay for the healthcare, and this will of course result in conflicting interests. The workforce will want to pay less taxes for the services that they do not currently require, while the elderly will want better healthcare for themselves. For the moment, this tension has not reached a boiling point. However, one can easily observe that Western countries are spending a larger and larger share of their GDP on healthcare, and that their workforce is becoming smaller and smaller as more people retire. These two trends will lead to a smaller number of taxpayers holding a larger tax burden, and thus to political and social tension. One cannot predict how this will play out, but as healthcare issues become healthcare crises, one could expect that the issue of euthanasia will accelerate the polarization between the young and the old. As more and more systems get closer to collapse, the old will call for increased funding to the point of bankrupting the state itself, while the young will see euthanasia as a solution to the burden of the older generations. In the countries with a privatized system, the result would be similar, but with class tensions playing a larger role. The increased demand would raise both insurance and medical costs. This is not even speculation. It already is a tangible reality in many countries, especially in the US. However, it is also important not to treat the US as a completely privatized system, since government programs such as Medicare and Medicaid represent 45% of all healthcare spending, with an estimated price tag of $1.5 trillion per year. That being said, most people, around 66%, have private healthcare insurance. The US has many other factors that have pushed up healthcare demand beyond just general aging. America is the major nation with the highest obesity rate in the world. They face a drug epidemic of historic proportions, and therefore they spend 17% of their GDP on healthcare, more than any other nation. This is an issue heavily tinged by social class. There are people who can afford medical treatment, those who would go bankrupt if their insurance denies their claim, those who are helped by the government programs, although this is often not enough, and those who are not insured at all. There are millions of people, especially young ones, that despise the current system because they cannot afford treatment. Perhaps the figure that best embodies this tension is Luigi Mangione. Indeed, it is a registered fact that a large percentage of young left-wingers admire Luigi. As the healthcare system becomes more strained in the foreseeable future, we can expect America to become more polarized in matters of class. It would also be a pretty safe bet to say that figures similar to Bernie Sanders are going to occupy a larger part in the discourse of the American left. However, the future of the American healthcare system is far less certain than in other countries due to the different demographic structure of its society and its own unique healthcare challenges. Now that we have talked about the different possible problems that each system might face in the future, I think it is important to go back to the topic at hand, which is, of course, euthanasia. The core argument of this essay is that there is a direct correlation between the strain of a healthcare system and its acceptance of the implementation of euthanasia, purely on practical grounds. The idea is that the closer a healthcare system gets to the worst-case scenario, the more euthanasia will become institutionalized and practiced on a large scale. If we take into account that the future prospects of both private and public healthcare systems are becoming increasingly grim, then it logically follows that euthanasia will play an increasingly larger role around the world. As of today, euthanasia is not widely practiced. There are only a handful of countries that have legalized voluntary assisted suicide, and in these countries, it remains the exception and not the rule. However, I will argue that this is because most healthcare systems in the industrialized countries of the world are nowhere near the worst-case scenario. There are certainly systems that are facing delays and difficulties, and others where medical care is becoming increasingly unaffordable, but it could be much, much worse. Let's imagine a scale where the best-case scenario is at 1 and the worst-case scenario is located at 0. When a society is close to a score of 1, active euthanasia is unthinkable, and passive euthanasia is only practiced in a handful of terminal cases. When a healthcare system finds itself around the middle of the scale, where it is under strain but not yet in crisis, we can expect that voluntary assisted suicide will be legalized and practiced at a small scale, much like Canada today. If a system approaches 0, meaning that there is an economic crisis, insufficient resources, and where the choice to save one patient and to let another one die is an everyday occurrence, millions of people will prefer a quick and painless death to a long and uncertain treatment, that is, if treatment is available at all. In times of crisis, it would also be possible that euthanasia could start being involuntary in some cases. I think that it is a pretty good historical rule of thumb that in desperate situations, a cold and inhumane logic takes hold of a society. Simply put, if a country is in crisis and it believes that the number of elderly people is dragging the nation down with them, a very cruel sort of logic could come to fruition. All of this might seem dramatic, unrealistic. Millions of people voluntarily committing suicide, millions more being forced to do so, hospitals having to decide who gets treatment and who does not on a daily basis. Doesn't this sound a little bit ridiculous? Well, maybe. This might be a valid point. However, I remain convinced that radical euthanasia programs will become a possibility if there is a sufficient crisis inside of a country in which the economy, the civil society, and the healthcare system cannot keep up with the needs of the population. I'm not a doctor, and much less a hospital administrator, so I'm not the indicated person to give accurate predictions on the future of most healthcare systems around the world. All that I can do is to point at the graphs and state the possible implications of a future healthcare crisis. It is important to underline the word possible, because a healthcare crisis is a completely new and unprecedented phenomenon. This has never happened before because there has never been a society where the elderly outnumber the working age population. Such a drastic change will also have drastic social and medical consequences. My money is on euthanasia. All that being said, this essay is very speculative and perhaps it will look very stupid in a couple of decades. However, I very much enjoy this type of speculation, and I think that what is indisputable is that healthcare will be one of the leading political issues of the 21st century, and that its social and cultural impact will be felt by all of us, and probably not for the best.